The spring rains had turned the hollow into a marsh, and every cabin along Blackburn Creek showed the telltale signs of foundation rot except one. While his neighbors pried apart soggy bottom logs and planned rebuilds, Eli Thornton walked the stone perimeter around his cabin in dry boots, the wood beneath his walls as solid as the day he'd set them 3 years earlier. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you see survival itself. The sound Marcus Webb's cabin made when it fell wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderous crash, no splintering explosion of timber. On the morning of April 19, 1842, the structure simply sagged at one corner, then slowly, almost gracefully, folded in on itself like a tired man sitting down after a long day's work. By the time Marcus scrambled outside with his rifle and possibles bag, the cabin he had built 4 years earlier was little more than a jumbled pile of logs and shattered roofing. He stood in the mud wearing only his long underwear and boots, watching smoke from his morning fire curl up through the wreckage, and realized how close he had come to being crushed in his sleep. Eli Thornton heard about the collapse from Isaac Morrow, who had been checking his trap line along the creek and seen the aftermath. Isaac stopped at Eli's place on his way back upstream, still shaken by what he had witnessed. Marcus had lost everything: his shelter, most of his supplies, his pelts from the winter season, all buried under hundreds of pounds of mud-chinked logs. The man was staying with Owen Garrett now, sleeping in a lean-to behind Owen's cabin while he figured out what to do next. Eli walked down to see the damage that afternoon. The path along Blackburn Creek was thick with spring mud, the kind that sucked at your boots and made every step an effort. The hollow was always wet this time of year. Snowmelt from the higher elevations combined with spring rains turned the creek into a rushing torrent and raised the water table until the ground itself seemed to weep moisture. Every cabin in the area dealt with damp floors and wet walls during these months. It was simply the cost of living in these mountains. Marcus was sitting on a stump near the ruins when Eli arrived. He looked older than his 38 years, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of defeated recognition that all his work had been wasted. The two men had been neighbors for 3 years, not close friends but friendly enough, the kind of relationship frontier isolation created between men who saw each other once or twice a month. Bottom logs rotted clean through, Marcus said without preamble, pointing at the collapsed corner. Didn't even know it was happening until the whole thing came down. Eli examined the wreckage carefully. The failure point was obvious once you knew where to look. The lowest logs, the ones that had rested directly on the earth, had turned soft and punky from constant moisture exposure. The rot had started on the underside where the wood contacted damp soil, then worked its way upward through the grain. By the time the damage became visible from inside the cabin, the structural integrity was already compromised. The weight of the upper walls and roof had done the rest, crushing the weakened base until the entire structure collapsed. What struck Eli most was how typical the damage looked. This wasn't unusual failure. This was the expected life cycle of an Appalachian cabin built using standard methods: 4 to 7 years of service, then rot at the foundation, then collapse or extensive rebuilding. Every mountaineer in the region understood this pattern. Most accepted it as inevitable, the price of using logs and living in a climate where moisture was constant. But standing there in the mud, looking at Marcus Webb's collapsed home, Eli Thornton found himself unable to accept that inevitability. There had to be a better way. Over the next 2 weeks, Eli became obsessed with foundation rot. He started paying attention to details he had previously ignored, examining every cabin he encountered with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve a specific problem. What he discovered was a consistent pattern of failure that stretched across the entire settlement, along Blackburn Creek and beyond into the wider hollows of the Appalachian region. Luther Hicks had a cabin that was 6 years old. The bottom logs on the north side, where shade kept the ground perpetually damp, showed soft spots when Eli pressed them with his thumb. Luther knew about the damage but planned to ignore it until the cabin became unlivable. "I'll get another year, maybe 2, he said with the fatalistic acceptance common among mountain men. "Then I'll tear it down and build fresh." Silas Pruitt's place was only 3 years old, but already showed rot at the corners where water pooled during heavy rains. Owen Garrett's cabin, built 5 years earlier on what seemed like high ground, had bottom logs that were spongy with moisture damage. Thomas Brennan, the oldest settler in the area at 54 years, was on his third cabin in 15 years. Each had failed the same way, rot starting at the foundation and working upward until rebuilding became necessary. The pattern was universal. Logs placed directly on earth absorbed ground moisture through capillary action. The wood stayed damp, never fully drying even during summer months. Fungi and bacteria colonized the perpetually wet timber, breaking down the wood fiber from the inside. The process was slow but relentless. No amount of careful construction could prevent it because the fundamental problem was the contact point between wood and damp earth. Eli talked to Daniel Cross, a traveling carpenter who passed through the region twice a year, trading his skills for supplies and shelter. Daniel had built cabins from Carolina to Kentucky and seen the same pattern everywhere. In dry country, cabins last 20-30 years, Daniel explained while helping Owen Garrett repair a shed door. But in wet country like these mountains, you're lucky to get 7 years before the bottom rots out. It's just how things are. But Eli kept returning to one question that others seemed unwilling to ask. Why did it have to be how things are? Men had been building log structures for centuries. Surely someone, somewhere, had figured out how to keep wood from rotting when placed near the ground. He thought about stone buildings he had seen in the lowland towns during his infrequent trips to trade. Stone didn't rot. Stone foundations supported wooden structures for generations. But hauling enough stone to build a complete foundation seemed impractical in the mountains, where every material had to be gathered by hand. There had to be a middle path, something more protective than simply setting logs on bare earth but less elaborate than full stone construction. Eli didn't know what that solution looked like yet, but he was certain it existed. The problem was too simple, too obvious, for there not to be an answer. He just had to find it. Eli's answer came from an unexpected source during a trip to the lowland settlement of Coopersville in late May. He had gone to trade furs and replenish supplies, a journey that took 2 days each direction. While waiting for the trading post to process his pelts, he wandered the small town, observing how permanent residents built their structures. What caught his attention was a stone spring house built beside a creek on the edge of town. The building itself wasn't remarkable, but the way water flowed around it was. The builder had dug a shallow trench encircling the structure, lined it with flat stones, and extended more flat stones outward from the trench to create a stone apron around the entire building. Water from spring rains ran off the stone surface, flowed into the trench, and was channeled away from the foundation. The earth around the spring house remained dry, even though the building sat beside a creek in low ground. Eli spent an hour examining the construction. The trench itself was simple, perhaps 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. The flat stones filling it were laid horizontally, creating drainage channels between them. But what made the system work was the flat stone surround extending outward. Rain hitting the ground near the building landed on stone instead of earth. The water couldn't soak into the soil and migrate toward the foundation because the stones created an impermeable barrier. Everything ran off the surface into the trench and away. He found the builder, an old German immigrant named Klaus Werner, working in his garden plot behind the spring house. Klaus explained the principle in heavily accented English. Water is like enemy. You must stop before it reaches the walls. Trench catches what flows underneath. Stones on top stop what falls from sky. Together, they keep building dry. Eli asked why more people didn't build this way. Klaus shrugged. Takes time. People here want fast. They build quick, then rebuild when it rots. In old country, we build once, build right. Here, different thinking. On the long ride back into the mountains, Eli's mind worked through the application. A spring house and a log cabin weren't identical, but the principle was the same. Keep moisture away from the foundation. The trench would intercept groundwater flowing toward the cabin. The flat stone surround would prevent rain from soaking into the earth near the walls. Together, they would create a dry zone around the entire structure. The more he considered it, the more convinced he became. This wasn't complicated engineering requiring special tools or skills. It was simple logic applied to a specific problem. Dig a trench around your cabin. Fill it with flat stones for drainage. Extend flat stones outward to create a protective apron. The work would take time, certainly far more time than standard cabin construction. But if it prevented rot, if it meant his cabin lasted 20 years instead of 5, the investment was worthwhile. By the time Eli reached his cabin on the third day, his decision was made. He would rebuild using this method, and he would do it right. Eli began work in early June of 1842. His existing cabin was only 2 years old, still structurally sound, but he understood what was coming. The bottom logs were already showing early signs of moisture damage. Rather than wait for inevitable failure, he decided to build a new cabin using Klaus Werner's principles while he still had shelter and could work methodically. He selected a site 50 yards from his old cabin on slightly higher ground with good drainage and clear sight lines. The location was less convenient for hauling water from the creek, but Eli prioritized foundation dryness over daily convenience. He spent 3 days clearing the site, removing vegetation, and leveling the ground. Then he began digging the trench. He marked a rectangle 18 feet by 14 feet, the dimensions of his planned cabin. 6 inches outside this perimeter, he began excavating. The trench needed to be 14 inches wide and 8 inches deep, running the complete perimeter of where his walls would stand. The work was backbreaking. The ground was rocky, forcing him to pry out stones with a digging bar before he could shovel. Progress was measured in feet per day, not yards. Isaac Morrow stopped by on the 4th day of digging and asked what Eli was doing. When Eli explained the wall trench system, Isaac's expression shifted from curiosity to skepticism. "You're digging a ditch around your cabin before you even build the cabin?" "It's not a ditch," Eli said, leaning on his shovel. "It's a drainage trench. Keeps groundwater away from the foundation." "Cabins don't need trenches," Isaac replied. "They need walls and roofs. You're wasting time." Word spread quickly. In a community of fewer than 30 families scattered across the hollows, any unusual behavior became immediate gossip. Within a week, everyone along Blackburn Creek knew that Eli Thornton was digging trenches around his building site instead of cutting logs. The reactions ranged from confusion to outright mockery. Owen Garrett rode up one afternoon and watched Eli work for several minutes before speaking. "You've lost your mind, Thornton. A man builds a cabin in 4, maybe 5 days. You've been digging holes for a week." "I'm preventing rot," Eli said without stopping his work. "You prevent rot by building on high ground and accepting you'll rebuild in 7 years. That's how it's done. Always has been." Silas Pruitt was more direct. He stopped by with Luther Hicks, and the 2 men stood at the edge of Eli's work site, making comments loud enough to be clearly heard. "Digging ditches like he's building a fort," Silas said. "Next he'll want a moat and a drawbridge." "City folk ideas," Luther added. "Probably read it in some book. Don't work in real mountains." Eli ignored them and kept digging. He had expected skepticism. Mountain men were deeply conservative about construction methods, trusting techniques passed down through generations. Innovation was viewed with suspicion, especially innovation that required more work than traditional approaches. But Eli had seen Marcus Webb's collapsed cabin. He had examined the rot patterns in every structure along the creek. He knew the standard methods led to inevitable failure. The trench took 3 weeks to complete. By late June, Eli had a continuous channel running around his entire building perimeter, 8 inches deep and 14 inches wide, with the bottom sloped slightly away from the center to encourage drainage. Now came the task that would generate even more mockery from his neighbors: gathering stones. Eli needed 2 types of stones. For filling the trench itself, he wanted flat field stones between 3 and 6 inches thick that could be laid horizontally in layers. For the surrounding apron, he needed flatter stones, as uniform as possible, that would fit together to create a relatively smooth surface. Both types had to be abundant because he needed hundreds of them. He started along the creek where water had exposed stone shelves and deposited flat rocks during flood seasons. He developed criteria that would have seemed obsessive to anyone watching. Each stone had to be genuinely flat, not just flattish. Each had to be dense and solid, not cracked or flaking. Each had to be a manageable weight for one man to carry. He rejected 3 stones for every one he kept. The hauling was brutal work. Even manageable stones weighed 20 to 40 pounds. The creek was 200 yards from his building site down a slope that became treacherous when wet. Eli rigged a sling from canvas and carried stones on his back, 2 or 3 at a time. On good days, he could make 15 trips. On bad days, when rain made the path slippery, he managed 8 or 9. Daniel Cross, the traveling carpenter, stopped during one of his circuits through the region and watched Eli haul stones for an afternoon. "You planning to build the cabin out of stone?" Daniel asked. "Just the foundation system," Eli replied, dropping 2 flat rocks near his trench. "That's a month's work you're doing there." "Maybe more. Rather spend a month now than rebuild in 5 years. Daniel studied the trench and the growing pile of stones. "I've seen stone foundations. Never seen anything like this." "What's it supposed to do?" Eli explained the complete system. The trench for subsurface drainage, the flat stones in the trench creating channels for water flow, the stone apron around the trench, preventing surface water from soaking into the ground near the foundation. Daniel listened carefully, then shook his head. "Might work. Might be a waste of effort. Hard to say until you try it." That was the most positive response Eli had received from anyone. Most of his neighbors had moved past skepticism into active ridicule. They had started calling him trench digger and stone hauler, using the nicknames with barely concealed contempt. Owen Garrett told anyone who would listen that Eli had gone peculiar and was wasting the prime building season on foolishness when he could be hunting and trapping. But Eli kept hauling stones. By mid-July, he had gathered enough to fill the trench and begin the surrounding apron. The physical work was exhausting, but the mental clarity it provided was valuable. Every stone he placed was one more piece of protection against the rot that destroyed every other cabin in these mountains. Eli began laying stones in early August. He started with the trench, placing flat field stones horizontally in overlapping layers. The technique was similar to shingling a roof but inverted. Each stone covered gaps in the layer below, creating a structure that allowed water to flow through channels while maintaining stability. He packed small gravel between larger stones, filling voids but preserving drainage passages. The trench filled slowly. Eli was particular about placement, adjusting each stone to maximize water flow and structural integrity. He angled stones slightly downward, away from where the cabin walls would stand, creating a subtle gradient that would encourage drainage outward. The work required constant decision-making. Which stone fit best in this position? How should it angle? Would this placement create proper channels for water movement? After 2 weeks, the trench was complete. Now came the element that would make his neighbors certain he had lost his mind, the flat stone surround. Eli began laying stones outward from both sides of the trench, creating a continuous stone platform that would eventually encircle the entire building site. He selected the flattest stones he had gathered, pieces that would fit together with minimal gaps. The apron extended 18 inches outward from the trench on the interior side, where his cabin walls would stand, and 24 inches outward on the exterior side. The total width of the stone system, measuring from outer edge to inner edge, was just over 5 feet. The platform looked excessive, almost decorative, like something a wealthy landowner might build around a manor house rather than something a mountain man needed for a wilderness cabin. Silas Pruitt rode up one afternoon and stared at the stonework for a full minute before speaking. "You're paving around your cabin, like it's a town square." "I'm keeping water away from the foundation," Eli replied, fitting another stone into place. "That's not foundation work. That's garden path nonsense. What's next, flower beds?" Luther Hicks visited the following day with similar comments. "The trench was crazy enough, but this? You've spent 2 months on stonework. You haven't even started building the actual cabin." It was true. Summer was passing, and Eli still had no walls, no roof, no shelter beyond his old cabin. A conventional builder would have completed an entire structure in the time Eli had spent on foundation preparation. But Eli understood something his neighbors didn't. The foundation was the structure's most critical element. Get it wrong, and everything else was temporary. Get it right, and the building lasted. He worked through August heat, placing stones with careful attention to fit and slope. The platform had to shed water, not collect it. Every stone was positioned to create a subtle outward grade, imperceptible to the eye, but effective at directing rainfall away from the center. By late August, the complete stone system was finished. 57 feet of trench filled with layered flat stones. 208 square feet of stone, apron surrounding it. The foundation was ready. Now he could build his cabin. Eli began cutting logs in September. He selected trees with obsessive care, wanting straight trunks with minimal taper and consistent diameter. Each log was stripped of bark using a draw knife, a process that added days to the work but eliminated the irregular surface bark created. The logs needed to fit tightly together, and that required uniform dimensions. He laid the first course of logs directly on the interior stone apron, positioning them 6 inches from the trench edge. The stone platform created a level, dry base that kept wood elevated above any ground moisture. Between each log, Eli packed a mixture he had developed: clay from the creek bank, horsehair from his own horse's tail, and pine resin boiled down from sap. The mixture dried into a flexible, waterproof seal far superior to traditional moss and mud chinking. The walls rose slowly. Eli used a corner technique he had seen Daniel Cross employ on a barn, extending logs past corners and pinning them together with wooden pegs driven through drilled holes. The method was slower than traditional notching but created corners that couldn't be pulled apart or shifted by settling. Each course was fitted carefully, gaps minimized, chinking applied with attention to complete coverage. By late September, the walls stood 6 feet high. The cabin was taking shape, and neighbors who passed by could no longer dismiss the project as pure foolishness. The structure looked solid, well-built, perhaps overbuilt but undeniably substantial. Owen Garrett stopped to examine the work and admitted grudgingly that the craftsmanship was good, even if the foundation system remained ridiculous in his opinion. "Still think you wasted 2 months on those stones," Owen said, running his hand along a wall log, "but I'll give you this: the cabin itself is tight work." Eli finished the walls in early October and began roof construction. He used the same careful approach, selecting straight poles for rafters, splitting planks for roof boards, and layering birch bark and clay for waterproofing. The roof overhang extended 18 inches beyond the walls on all sides, far more than standard construction. The overhang would direct rainfall away from the walls and onto the stone apron, where it would run off into the trench system. He built a stone fireplace in one corner, gathering flat rocks and using clay mortar to create a structure with proper draft and a narrow chimney. He constructed a door from thick planks, reinforcing it with diagonal bracing and hanging it on heavy iron hinges he had purchased in Coopersville specifically for this purpose. He cut a small window high on the south wall and fitted it with a shuttered opening. By late October, the cabin was complete and habitable. The entire process had taken nearly 5 months from first breaking ground to moving his possessions inside. A standard cabin required 4 to 5 days. Eli's neighbors considered this final proof of his poor judgment. He had spent an entire building season on one cabin, sacrificing hunting and trapping opportunities, investing absurd amounts of labor in foundation work that served no obvious purpose. The real test would come with winter and spring. Winter arrived early in 1842. Snow fell in mid-November and continued intermittently through March. The accumulation in the hollows reached depths of 3 feet, transforming the landscape into a monochrome wilderness where travel became difficult and most men stayed close to their cabins, living off stored supplies and venturing out only to hunt or check trap lines. Eli's first winter in the new cabin revealed the secondary benefits of his foundation system. The stone apron, buried under snow, created a thermal mass that moderated temperature fluctuations. The tight log fitting and superior chinking eliminated drafts that plagued most mountain cabins. The robust door and well-fitted window shutter kept wind out completely. Interior temperatures remained surprisingly stable, requiring less firewood than his previous cabin, despite the structure being slightly larger. But the real test came in April when the snow melted. Spring of 1843 brought exceptional rainfall. Storms rolled through the mountains in waves, dumping inches of water that turned every creek into a torrent and every hollow into a marsh. The ground became saturated, unable to absorb more moisture. Water pooled around cabin foundations throughout the region, sitting against bottom logs for days or weeks, creating ideal conditions for rot to establish itself. Marcus Webb, who had rebuilt his cabin the previous summer using traditional methods, watched water collect around his foundation with grim resignation. He knew what was happening beneath the visible surface. Ground moisture was wicking into his bottom logs, starting the slow process of decay that would eventually require another rebuild. Owen Garrett's cabin developed standing water on the north side where drainage was poorest. Luther Hicks noticed his door frame was swelling from moisture absorption, making the door difficult to open. Eli walked his stone perimeter during the worst of the rains and observed how the system performed. Water hitting the ground near his cabin landed on the stone apron and ran off immediately, flowing into the trench. The trench, filled with layered flat stones, channeled the water away from the foundation along drainage paths Eli had created during construction. No water pooled, no moisture accumulated against his logs. The stone system shed water exactly as Klaus Werner's spring house had, keeping the critical junction between wood and earth completely dry. Isaac Morrow visited during a break in the weather and noticed the difference immediately. "Your ground is dry," he said, pointing at the stone apron. "Everywhere else is mud and standing water, but around your cabin, it's like the rain never happened." Eli didn't gloat or point out that he had predicted this outcome. He simply explained what was happening beneath the visible surface. The trench intercepted subsurface water flow. The stone apron prevented surface water infiltration. Together, they created a zone of protection that kept his foundation perpetually dry regardless of weather conditions. The investment of 5 months' labor was proving its worth in the first serious test. Thomas Brennan, the oldest settler in the area, came specifically to examine the system after Isaac told him about it. Thomas Brennan walked the entire perimeter of Eli's cabin, studying the stonework with the careful attention of a man who had built and rebuilt structures for 3 decades. He was 55 years old, weathered and experienced, and he carried the authority that age and survival conferred in frontier communities. When Thomas spoke, people listened. When he endorsed an idea, skepticism diminished. He knelt beside the trench, running his fingers along the flat stones, feeling how water moved through the channels. He examined the stone apron, noting the subtle slope that directed rainfall outward. He checked the bottom logs, finding them completely dry despite weeks of rain. Finally, he stood and looked at Eli, with an expression that mixed respect and something close to regret. "You solved it," Thomas said simply. "The problem every cabin builder in these mountains faces, you solved it." "The idea came from a spring house in Coopersville," Eli admitted. "I just applied it to cabin construction. Doesn't matter where it came from, matters that it works." Thomas gestured at the stone system. "I've built 4 cabins in my time here. Everyone rotted at the foundation within 7 years. I accepted that as how things were. Never occurred to me that the problem could be prevented instead of just endured." Word of Thomas Brennan's endorsement spread through the community, faster than the original mockery had. If Thomas said Eli's foundation system worked, it worked. The old man's opinion carried weight that Eli's explanations never could. Within days, neighbors who had ridiculed the wall trench began asking questions. How deep was the trench? What kind of stones worked best? Did the apron need to extend on both sides or just the exterior? Jacob Winters was the first to commit to building his own cabin using Eli's method. Jacob was planning to construct a new place anyway, having bought land up Panther Branch the previous fall. He rode to Eli's cabin in late April and asked for detailed guidance. Eli spent an afternoon explaining every aspect: trench dimensions, stone selection criteria, apron width, drainage angles, the importance of doing both trench and surround rather than just one component. "Most important thing," Eli emphasized, "is understanding that both parts work together. The trench alone helps, but it's not enough. The stone apron is what keeps water from reaching the trench in the first place. You need both." Jacob began work in May and followed Eli's instructions precisely. He dug his trench, gathered stones for weeks, laid them carefully in overlapping layers, and extended the flat stone surround on both sides. The work took him nearly as long as it had taken Eli. But by late summer, Jacob had a cabin built on a foundation system identical to the one that had kept Eli's structure dry through the wettest spring anyone could remember. Luther Hicks tried a shortcut. He dug a trench around his existing cabin and filled it with stones, but he skipped the flat stone surround, considering it excessive and decorative. The trench helped reduce moisture problems, but his bottom logs still showed dampness after heavy rains. By 1845, 7 cabins along Blackburn Creek and the surrounding hollows had been built using what locals now called the Thornton Trench System. The name embarrassed Eli, who insisted he had simply borrowed an idea from a German immigrant springhouse, but names stick regardless of their origins, and the technique became permanently associated with him. The cabins, built with complete systems, both trench and stone surround, remained dry through subsequent wet seasons. Those built with only trenches, like Luther Hicks' retrofit, showed improvement over standard construction but still developed moisture problems during extreme weather. The evidence became undeniable. The complete system worked. Partial implementations provided partial protection. Standard construction led to inevitable rot. Daniel Cross, the traveling carpenter, began recommending the technique to clients throughout the region. He had seen enough failed cabins to recognize genuine innovation when it appeared. By 1848, variations of the wall trench system were appearing in settlements as far south as the Smoky Mountains and as far west as the Cumberland Gap. The specific details varied based on available materials and local conditions, but the core principle remained consistent. Dig a perimeter trench for subsurface drainage, fill it with stones, and extend a stone apron to prevent surface water infiltration. Marcus Webb rebuilt again in 1846, this time using Eli's complete method. His previous cabin, constructed traditionally after his original collapse, was already showing foundation rot after just 4 years. The pattern would have continued indefinitely if he hadn't changed approaches. His new cabin, built on a proper stone trench system, would still be standing 20 years later when Marcus's son inherited the property. The technique saved more than cabins. It saved resources, labor, and in at least 2 documented cases, lives. When Owen Garrett's traditionally built cabin collapsed during a windstorm in 1849, he was away checking trap lines. Had he been inside, the falling logs might have killed him. When Silas Pruitt's cabin failed in 1851, his wife and infant daughter barely escaped before the structure came down. Buildings that lasted decades instead of years meant fewer reconstructions, fewer moments of vulnerability, fewer chances for tragedy. Eli himself never profited from the innovation. He shared his knowledge freely with anyone who asked, never charging for consultations or demanding recognition. He continued trapping and hunting, living quietly in the cabin that had started everything. The structure aged well. By 1850, 8 years after construction, the logs showed no signs of rot. By 1860, the cabin remained solid, while contemporaries built using traditional methods had been rebuilt twice or abandoned entirely. The broader principle the wall trench system demonstrated was more valuable than the specific technique. Frontier life didn't have to mean accepting inevitable failure. Traditional methods weren't sacred simply because they were traditional. Problems that seemed inherent to wilderness living could be solved through observation, adaptation, and willingness to invest extra effort during construction to avoid repeated failure later. Eli Thornton died in 1873 at age 61. He was buried on a hillside overlooking Blackburn Creek, not far from the cabin he had built 3 decades earlier. The structure still stood, weathered but intact, its foundation as solid as the day he had laid the final stone. The wall trench that had seemed so foolish in 1842 had kept wood dry for over 30 years, proving that sometimes the most valuable innovations aren't dramatic breakthroughs, but simple solutions to basic problems that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable.